Frank Miller's daily routine hadn't changed much in 30 years. Each morning, he woke up at 5:30, kissed his sleeping wife Linda on the forehead, and quietly made his coffee in the kitchen of their modest two-bedroom house. By 6:15, he was already on the road, driving his old blue pickup truck to Wilson's Auto Repair, where he arrived exactly at 6:45, 15 minutes before the shop officially opened. On this particular morning, Frank pulled into his usual parking spot, the one with the small crack in the pavement that everyone in the shop jokingly called Frank's spot. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the garage as he unlocked the side door, flipped on the lights, and breathed in the familiar smell of motor oil and rubber that had become as comforting to him as the scent of Linda's cooking. Frank set up the coffee pot for the rest of the team and customers, just as he had done every morning for decades. The coffee maker was old and temperamental, but Frank knew exactly how to position the pot to prevent it from leaking. While the coffee brewed, he put on his navy blue work shirt with Frank stitched above the pocket in red thread. The shirt had been washed so many times that the blue had faded, but Frank refused to replace it. "It's just getting broken in," he'd tell the younger guys whenever they teased him about it. At 57, Frank wasn't the young man who had first walked through these doors with nothing but basic knowledge and a willingness to learn. His once dark hair was now mostly gray, and deep lines marked the corners of his eyes from years of squinting at engine parts. His hands, once smooth, were now rough and calloused, with permanent black lines under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. But those hands were magic when it came to cars. Frank could place his palm on a hood and feel the slightest irregular vibration. He could diagnose problems just by listening to an engine run. "That's a loose timing belt," he'd say, "or your water pump's about to go," and he was almost always right. The other mechanics started arriving around 7:15. First came Joe, who'd been working at Wilson's for nearly 20 years himself. Then the younger guys, Ben, who was quick with the computer diagnostics but still learning the feel of engines, and Tom, who had started as a high school kid sweeping floors and was now working his way up. "Morning, Frank," Joe called out, grabbing a mug of coffee. "Heard Mrs. Henderson's bringing in her Buick again." Frank nodded. "Third time this month. Her grandson's been driving it, racing it from the sounds of it. That transmission won't hold much longer if he keeps that up." The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm that Frank had grown to love. He worked on a stubborn brake job while explaining to Tom how to tell when brake pads were nearing the end of their life without even removing the wheels. Customers came and went, many asking specifically for Frank. "Is Frank here today?" they'd ask at the front desk. "I won't let anyone else touch my car." During lunch, Frank sat on the bench outside, unwrapping the sandwich Linda had made him and looking through the pictures in his wallet. Linda on their wedding day, their two kids growing up over the years, and now pictures of their first grandchild. His locker inside was covered with more photos, plus thank you cards from customers and drawings from his grandkid. Frank never called in sick, not even during Linda's cancer scare 5 years back. He'd work all day, then head straight to the hospital to sit with her until visiting hours ended. The guys at the shop had pitched in, covering his shifts when he needed to take her to treatments, but Frank still managed to come in most days, even if just for a few hours. As afternoon turned to evening, Frank stayed late finishing up Mrs. Henderson's Buick, making sure the transmission would hold up a bit longer. He could have left it for tomorrow, but that wasn't his way. When a job came in, it got done right, and it got done on time. "You heading home anytime soon?" Joe asked as he grabbed his jacket, ready to leave. Frank smiled, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just about done. Want to make sure Mrs. Henderson can pick this up first thing tomorrow." 30 years, and I've never seen you leave on time," Joe laughed. "Why start now?" Frank replied, turning back to the car, completely unaware that his whole world was about to change. The first sign of change came on a Tuesday morning when Frank arrived at his usual time to find 3 sleek black cars parked in the customer spaces. He frowned slightly as he walked past them. The shop wasn't supposed to open for another 15 minutes, and they never scheduled customers this early. Inside, Frank found Mr. Wilson, the owner who had given him his first job 30 years ago, sitting at his cluttered desk with 3 men in business suits. The strangers had leather folders open in front of them, and Mr. Wilson looked tired, older somehow than he had just days before. "Morning, Frank," Mr. Wilson said, his voice lacking its usual cheer. "These gentlemen are from Motorworks Incorporated. They've bought the shop." Frank stood frozen, coffee pot in hand, as Mr. Wilson explained how rising costs and competition from bigger chains had forced his hand. At 68, he was ready to retire, and Motorworks had made an offer he couldn't refuse. "Nothing will change day to day," one of the men said, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "I'm Richard Cooper, Regional Manager. We're excited to bring Wilsons into the Motorworks family." Frank shook his hand automatically, noticing how smooth it was, with no grease under the fingernails, no calluses from years of gripping wrenches and cranking stubborn bolts. Just the hand of someone who pointed at problems rather than fixing them. Over the next few weeks, everything changed despite Richard's promises. The old waiting room furniture, worn but comfortable armchairs where customers had sat sipping free coffee while Frank explained exactly what their cars needed, was replaced with hard plastic seats and a vending machine. Signs appeared everywhere. Standard service times, approved parts only, efficiency protocol. The coffee pot disappeared, replaced by a complicated machine that required customers to pay $4 for a cup that didn't taste half as good as Frank's brew. One morning, Frank arrived to find a row of tablets mounted on the wall. A young woman in a Motorworks polo shirt was waiting to train the staff. "This is our new digital intake system," she explained, tapping through screens that asked for customer information, vehicle details, and service selections from drop-down menus. "It optimizes workflow and ensures standardization across all Motorworks locations." Joe leaned over to Frank and whispered, "What happened to just asking folks what's wrong with their car?" Frank watched as Ben and Tom adapted quickly to the new system, their young fingers flying across the screens. But Frank struggled. The tablet didn't have an option for that funny noise when you turn left, but only when it's cold outside, the kind of description real customers gave, the kind Frank had always been able to translate into the right fix. New mechanics arrived, young guys fresh from technical school who knew the computer systems but flinched at the sound of knocking valves. Meanwhile, old faces disappeared. First Pete from the front desk was replaced by a cheerful young woman who followed a script when answering phones. Then Mike, who had handled all their electrical work for 15 years, was let go after refusing to cut his diagnostic time in half. "It's just business," Richard explained during a staff meeting, not looking any of them in the eye. Motorworks has systems that have proven successful across 200 locations nationwide. Customers noticed the changes too. Mrs. Henderson came in for an oil change and left confused when no one offered to check her transmission fluid or top off her washer fluid like Frank always had. Mr. Reyes, who'd been bringing his work vans to Wilson's for 20 years, stormed out when told they no longer offered the flexible payment plan that had helped him keep his small plumbing business afloat during tough times. Frank tried to adapt. He downloaded the Motorworks app on his phone and studied the new computer system at night while Linda watched TV beside him. He attempted to complete oil changes in the new optimal time frame of 15 minutes, but couldn't bring himself to skip checking the brakes and tire pressure like the manual suggested if time is running short. During his performance review, Richard showed Frank a spreadsheet with his name highlighted in red. "Your customer satisfaction scores are high," Richard admitted, "but your efficiency metrics are well below target. You're spending too much time per vehicle, Frank." Frank thought of Mrs. Henderson's grandson, who might be driving with bad brakes if he'd stuck to the optimal time frame. He thought of Mr. Reyes, whose check engine light would have become a blown engine if Frank hadn't taken those extra 5 minutes. "I've always believed in doing the job right," Frank said quietly. Richard closed his laptop. "The automotive repair business has changed, Frank. Either you change with it or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Frank could see the writing on the wall as clearly as the new Motorworks logo that had replaced the hand-painted Wilson's Auto Repair sign he'd helped put up 25 years ago. Rain pounded against the garage doors that Friday afternoon, creating a steady drumming that normally would have been soothing to Frank. He'd always loved rainy days at the shop. They were quieter with fewer customers, giving him time to catch up on the more complicated jobs or to teach the younger guys something new. But today, the rain just made everything feel heavier as he worked on replacing a timing belt. His mind wasn't fully on the job. Earlier, he'd overheard Richard on the phone talking about further staff adjustments and Phase 2 of the transition plan. The words had stuck with him all day, settling like a cold weight in his stomach. Just after 3 o'clock, Jenny from the front desk appeared at his bay. Her face told him everything before she even spoke. "Frank, Richard wants to see you in his office when you reach a stopping point," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. Frank wiped his hands slowly on a shop rag, taking his time. He knew what was coming. 3 mechanics had already been let go in the past month. He glanced around the garage that had been his second home for 30 years, at the toolbox he'd built himself, at the wall where heights of his kids had been marked in pencil during Bring Your Child to Work days, at Jer working 2 bays down, pretending not to watch. The walk to Richard's office, what used to be Mr. Wilson's office, felt longer than usual. Frank passed the new computerized diagnostic center that had replaced their old equipment. He passed Ben, who quickly looked away, and Tom, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Richard was typing on his laptop when Frank knocked on the open door. Next to him sat a woman Frank had seen only once before, someone from the corporate HR department. A folder with Frank's name on it lay on the desk between them. "Have a seat, Frank," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from him. The chair squeaked as Frank lowered himself into it. Mr. Wilson had always joked about that squeaky chair, saying he kept it that way on purpose so he could tell when someone was uncomfortable. "As you know, Motorworks has been implementing our standardized procedures across all locations," Richard began, reciting words that sounded rehearsed. "Part of that process involves evaluating our staffing needs and ensuring our team members align with the company's forward-looking vision." Frank simply nodded, watching a raindrop make its way down the window behind Richard's head. "While we value your years of experience," Richard continued, "we've determined that your position doesn't align with our current business model. We're moving toward a more specialized approach with technicians focused on specific systems rather than general mechanics." The HR woman slid some papers across the desk. "This is your severance package. As you've been with the company for quite some time, you'll receive 8 weeks of pay. Your health benefits will continue through the end of next month, and of course, your pension plan remains intact." Frank stared at the papers without really seeing them. 30 years of his life summed up in a few paragraphs of corporate language. "Your methodical approach served Wilson's well in its time," Richard added, as if trying to soften the blow. "But our data shows that specialized teams working within standardized timeframes increase overall shop efficiency by 23%. Frank found his voice at last. "And what about quality? What about Mrs. Henderson's car that needs extra attention, or the Reyes family's vans that keep their business running?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Our quality control metrics are designed to maintain consistent service standards." "Consistent isn't always the same as good," Frank said quietly. The HR woman cleared her throat. "We'll need you to clean out your personal items today. Jenny has prepared some boxes for you." Rain was still falling as Frank emptied his locker. His movements were mechanical as he placed each item in the cardboard box: the family photos, the coffee mug his daughter had made him in 3rd grade, the small toolbox his father had given him when he first started at Wilson's. 30 years of memories reduced to a single box. The other mechanics kept their distance, some making a show of being busy with repairs, others throwing glances his way, but quickly looking away when he noticed. Nobody knew what to say. Only Joe approached, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder. "This ain't right," Joe muttered. "This just ain't right." Frank managed a small smile. "It's their shop now. Their rules." When he'd finished clearing his locker, Frank took one last look around the garage. Ben was watching him from across the shop floor, his young face troubled. Frank walked over to him. "That Chevy in Bay 3, Frank said, keeping his voice steady. "Check the vacuum lines before you replace the oxygen sensor. 9 times out of 10, that's the real problem." Ben nodded, his eyes wide. "I will, Frank, I promise." Outside, Frank stood in the rain for a moment, looking at the new Motorworks sign where the Wilson's auto repair sign had hung for decades. Then he placed his box carefully in the passenger seat of his truck, slid behind the wheel, and sat there, wondering how he was going to tell Linda that after 30 years, he wouldn't be coming back tomorrow. The first week without work felt like a strange vacation to Frank. He slept past 5:30 for the first time in decades, though his body still woke him by 6:15 out of habit. He made pancakes for Linda on Tuesday morning, something he hadn't done since their kids were small. He fixed the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom and finally painted the back porch like Linda had been asking him to do for 3 summers. But by the second week, the novelty wore off. Frank found himself standing in the kitchen at 6:45 each morning, coffee in hand, staring out the window at nothing in particular. The silence in the house pressed in on him. No clanging of tools, no rumble of engines, no banter with Joe or questions from the younger guys. You could join the walking group at the senior center, Linda suggested one morning, watching him pace around the kitchen, or maybe volunteer somewhere. Frank just nodded, but the thought of introducing himself to new people made his stomach tight. Who was he now, if not the head mechanic at Wilson's? That identity had carried him for 30 years. By the third week, Frank had applied to every auto shop within 20 miles. Each time, the response was the same. "Your experience is impressive, Mr. Miller," a manager at Dave's Auto told him, looking uncomfortable. "But we're really looking for someone with, more experience with newer systems." At Harry's garage, the owner was more direct. "Look, Frank, I'll be honest. You're overqualified, and I can't match what you were making at Wilson's. I'd have to pay you less than guys with half your experience, and we both know that's not right." Frank lowered his asking salary with each application, but it made no difference. Some places didn't even call him back after seeing his age on the application or hearing how long he'd been at his previous job. At home, he started spending hours in their garage, tinkering with their old sedan that ran perfectly fine but gave him something to do with his hands. He changed the oil even though it didn't need changing. He rotated the tires and then rotated them back the next day. He cleaned spark plugs and adjusted belts that needed no adjusting. "Dad, we can help out if things are tight," his daughter said during her Sunday visit. She had driven over with her husband and their 5-year-old son after Frank and Linda had skipped their usual family dinner for the second week in a row. "We're fine," Frank assured her, though he'd been awake the night before calculating how long their savings would last. "The pension kicks in next month and the severance is holding us over. Don't you worry about us." But worry had become Frank's constant companion. He worried about the mortgage payment due in 2 weeks. He worried about Linda's medication, which their insurance had covered until now. Most of all, he worried about the emptiness of his days stretching out before him. "You've been fixing Mrs. Peterson's car?" Linda asked one evening, finding him studying their checkbook at the kitchen table. Frank nodded. "Just a small job. Her son usually takes care of it, but he's out of town." Linda didn't mention that he hadn't charged Mrs. Peterson anything, or that he'd bought the parts with their grocery money. She just squeezed his shoulder and left him to his figuring. Meanwhile, across town, Wilson's, now Motorworks Bay 17, was changing in Frank's absence. Joe had called a few times with updates, his voice low as if he was afraid of being overheard. "They've got us doing oil changes like we're running a fast food joint," he told Frank. "Timer goes off if we take more than 20 minutes. Customer came back yesterday with oil all over his driveway because someone forgot to tighten the drain plug properly." Frank winced at the thought. In his day, they'd double-checked everything, no matter how simple the job. "And you know Mrs. Henderson? She brought her Buick in making that knocking sound you always fixed. New kid told her she needed a whole new engine. Nearly gave her a heart attack until I stepped in and figured out it was just that loose heat shield you used to fix for her." Frank found himself driving past the shop sometimes, slowing down to peer at the cars in the lot. He recognized most of them. Mr. Ray's work vans, Dr. Clark's old Mercedes, the Taylor family's minivan. He wondered who was taking care of them now, whether anyone was checking that Mrs. Taylor's minivan had enough coolant for her long summer trips, or making sure Mr. Ray's brake pads weren't wearing unevenly like they tended to do. One evening in the 4th week, Frank's phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Frank Miller?" a vaguely familiar voice asked when he answered. "Speaking," Frank replied, expecting another rejection from a job application. "Frank, it's Robert Wilson." Frank sat up straighter. He hadn't heard from his old boss since the day the sale to Motorworks was announced. "I've been hearing some things about what's happening at the old shop," Robert said. "Think you and I should have a talk. Are you free for coffee tomorrow?" For the first time in weeks, Frank felt a small spark of something that might have been hope. The coffee shop on Main Street was nearly empty when Frank arrived the next morning. He spotted Robert Wilson at a corner table, looking much the same as he had for the 30 years Frank had known him. A bit grayer perhaps, but still with that straight-backed posture and clear-eyed gaze that had commanded respect from both customers and employees. Frank felt oddly nervous as he approached, straightening his collar and wishing he'd gotten a haircut. It had been over a month since he'd dressed in anything other than his old work clothes or pajamas. "Frank," Robert stood and extended his hand. "Good to see you, my friend. You're looking well." Frank knew that was a polite lie. The mirror had shown him the truth that morning, the dark circles under his eyes, the slumped shoulders that Linda kept telling him to straighten, the additional gray in his mustache that seemed to have appeared overnight after he'd been let go. "Good to see you too, Mr. Wilson," Frank said, shaking his hand. "How many times do I have to tell you to call me Robert?" The older man smiled, gesturing to the chair across from him. 30 years and you still can't drop the mister." Frank managed a small smile as he sat down. Old habits. A waitress brought them coffee, and for a few minutes, they caught up on surface-level things. How Linda was doing, Robert's fishing trips, the unseasonably warm weather. Frank found himself relaxing slightly, remembering all the times he and Robert had shared coffee in the small break room at the shop, talking through tricky repairs or challenging customers. Finally, Robert set down his cup and leaned forward. "I've been keeping tabs on what's happening at the old place," he said, his voice turning serious. "Joe calls me now and then, so do some of the customers." Frank nodded but said nothing. "That Motor Works outfit," Robert continued, shaking his head. "I knew they were all about the bottom line, but I thought they'd at least have the sense to keep the good people on. Firing you was about the dumbest thing they could have done." "Business decision," Frank said with a shrug, though it felt good to hear someone say out loud what he'd been thinking. "Bad business," Robert countered. "Mrs. Henderson called me at home last week, upset about how they'd treated her Buick. And Tom Parker, with the construction company, says they charged him double what we used to for half the service." Frank stared into his coffee cup. Not much to be done about it now. "Actually," Robert said, sliding a folded newspaper across the table, "that's why I wanted to talk to you." Frank opened the paper to find it folded to the classifieds. A red circle marked a small advertisement. "Commercial property for lease, 1250 Elm Street. Former warehouse, suitable for automotive or light industrial use." Frank looked up, confused. "I don't understand." Robert leaned forward, his eyes bright with an excitement Frank hadn't seen since the early days of Wilson's Auto. "I sold the business to Motor Works, Frank, but I kept the property. They're on a 5-year lease. What I didn't tell them was that I owned this other property too." He tapped the advertisement. "Okay," Frank said slowly, still not following. "I've been thinking about it since I heard what happened to you." "I'm not ready for a rocking chair yet," Robert grinned. "That warehouse is just sitting there, and it's already got 2 service bays from when it was a truck repair shop." Frank felt his heart rate pick up slightly. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying I've got the location and the capital. You've got the skills and the customer relationships." Robert sat back, watching Frank's face. "I'm proposing we open a new shop, but not as employer and employee this time, as partners, equal partners." The words hung in the air between them. Frank took a slow sip of his coffee, buying time as his mind raced. "A new shop," he repeated, testing how the words felt. "But Motor Works has no non-compete clause with you," Robert finished. "I checked. They fired you, remember? And my contract with them doesn't prevent me from opening another business." Frank thought of his dwindling savings, of Linda's worried looks when she thought he couldn't see, of the emptiness of his days. "I can't match what you were making before," Robert admitted. "Not at first, but you'd have ownership stake. When profits come in, you'd get your share." "If profits come in," Frank corrected. Robert chuckled. "You always were cautious. But think about it. How many customers have been with you for decades? How many would follow you to a new place if they knew you were there?" Frank thought of Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Reyes, of Dr. Clark and the Taylor family. He thought of Joe, still stuck at Motor Works with their timers and efficiency metrics. 2 weeks flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Frank and Robert signed the lease on the Elm Street property, ordered equipment, and filed paperwork for their new business. Linda helped design a simple logo for Wilson and Miller Auto Care using the same blue and red colors that the original Wilsons had used for decades. "There's just one more thing I need to do before we open," Frank told Robert as they stood in their nearly ready shop, surveying the clean floors and gleaming tools. "I need to go back to Motorworks. Just once." Robert raised his eyebrows but didn't question him. "Want me to come with you?" Frank shook his head. "No, this is something I need to do myself." The next day, Frank dressed in his best shirt, the navy button-down Linda had bought him for their daughter's college graduation. He carefully printed a stack of business cards with the Wilson and Miller logo and address, tucking them into his pocket. The drive to his old workplace felt both familiar and strange, like visiting a childhood home now occupied by strangers. He timed his visit purposely, at 11:30 on a Saturday, when he knew the shop would be at its busiest. Weekend rushes had always been hectic at Wilson's, with people dropping off cars before weekend trips or bringing in vehicles they hadn't had time to deal with during the work week. Frank pulled into the parking lot and sat for a moment, looking at the Motorworks sign that still felt out of place to him. Through the large windows, he could see the waiting room was packed with people. Good. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his truck and walked toward the entrance with his head high and shoulders back, the way he carried himself for 30 years as the head mechanic. As his hand touched the door handle, he had a flash of memory. His first day at Wilson's, young and nervous, wondering if he'd make it in the automotive world. Now here he was, about to walk back in as an owner of his own shop. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The sound was the same, but everything else had changed. The waiting room had been remodeled with hard plastic chairs arranged in rows. A television blade in the corner, though no one seemed to be watching it. The air smelled of artificial air freshener instead of the coffee he used to brew. At first, no one noticed him. The front desk staff, people he didn't recognize, were busy dealing with frustrated customers. Then an older woman in the corner looked up from her magazine. Frank Miller, is that you?" It was Mrs. Henderson, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowded room. Heads turned. The conversation died away as people recognized him. Mr. Reyes from the plumbing company, the Taylor family, Dr. Clark with his distinctive white beard. One by one, customers stood up, some breaking into smiles, others looking relieved to see a familiar face. "Frank, when did they bring you back?" Dr. Clark called out, stepping toward him. Before Frank could answer, a door from the service area swung open. Richard appeared, clipboard in hand, stopping short when he saw Frank. His face went pale, then flushed. Behind him, Joe froze mid-step, a wrench still in his hand. Ben and Tom peered around the doorway, their eyes wide. The room fell completely silent. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Frank could feel Richard's eyes on him, wary and calculating, probably wondering if this was some kind of scene or confrontation in the making. Instead, Frank smiled and reached into his pocket. He pulled out his stack of business cards and turned to address the room. "I wanted to personally invite all of you to the grand opening of Wilson and Miller Auto Care," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Mr. Wilson and I are opening our doors next Monday on Elm Street. We'd be honored to take care of your vehicles the way we always have, with honest work, fair prices, and no shortcuts." He began moving around the room, handing a card to each customer. Mrs. Henderson took hers with a delighted smile. "Thank goodness. They wanted to charge me $300 for what you always fixed for $80. Mr. Reyes clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll be sitting my vans first thing Monday morning, Frank. This place hasn't been the same without you." Richard stepped forward, his professional smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Frank, I'm not sure this is appropriate," but Frank wasn't there to argue. He simply nodded politely to Richard and continued distributing his cards. He made his way to the service area door where Joe, Ben, and Tom still stood watching. "We'll be needing good mechanics," he said quietly, slipping them each a card. "Experienced ones who know the value of doing a job right." Joe's face broke into a grin. "I might know a few people looking for a change." Frank completed his circuit of the room, then turned to face everyone one last time. "Coffee's always free at Wilson and Miller," he said, "and we never rush a job that needs doing right." With that, he walked toward the exit, feeling lighter than he had in months. As the door swung closed behind him, he heard the buzz of excited conversation resume, louder than before. Through the window, he could see Richard frantically trying to regain control of the situation, but several customers were already gathering their belongings, clearly planning to follow Frank out the door. In his truck, Frank took a moment to breathe. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear or anger, but from a surge of something that felt a lot like victory. He hadn't come to gloat or cause trouble, he'd simply reminded people they had a choice. As he started the engine, he glanced once more at his old workplace. Through the window, he could see Joe giving him a supple thumbs up. Frank nodded in return, then pulled away, heading home to tell Linda about the grand opening that now promised to be even grander than they'd planned. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Frank stood at the counter of Wilson and Miller Auto Care, sipping coffee from his favorite mug, the chipped one his daughter had made him years ago. The shop hummed with the sound of tools and friendly conversation between mechanics and customers. The grand opening had exceeded all expectations. A line of cars had stretched down Elm Street that first Monday morning, with Mrs. Henderson proudly at the front. By noon, they'd been booked solid for 2 weeks. Robert had looked at Frank with wide eyes and said, "I think we're going to need more lifts." Now, watching the smooth operation of their growing business, Frank felt a contentment he hadn't expected to find again after being let go. The concrete floor gleamed with a fresh coat of sealant. Neat rows of tools hung on papeboards, and a comfortable waiting area featured the same kind of armchairs that had been in the original Wilsons, salvaged from Robert's basement. Joe walked in from the service bay, wiping his hands on a rag. After 2 months at Motorworks following Frank's dismissal, he'd finally had enough and joined Wilson and Miller as their second mechanic. Now he supervised their small but growing team. "Baker family's minivan is all set," Joe reported. "That transmission flush did the trick." They were right to be worried. Another 1,000 miles, and they'd have been looking at a full replacement. Frank nodded. "Good catch. Did you show them what was in the fluid?" "Sure did. Mr. Baker said to thank you for suggesting the service even though they only came in for an oil change." This was the Wilson and Miller difference that had quickly earned them a reputation across town. No rushed jobs, no unnecessary repairs, but also no overlooked issues that could cause bigger problems down the road. The bell above the door jingled, and Ben walked in, looking nervous in a clean shirt with his work boots freshly polished. "Morning, Mr. Miller," he said, fidgeting slightly. I wanted to talk to you about that apprenticeship position you mentioned." Frank smiled. Ben had been one of the last holdouts at Motorworks, trying to make it work even as conditions deteriorated. But last week, when he brought his own car to Wilson and Miller for help with a problem Motorworks couldn't solve, something had changed in his eyes as he watched Frank work. "Come on back to the office," Frank said, patting the young man's shoulder. "Joe's been saying we need another set of hands around here." By lunchtime, they had hired not only Ben, but also arranged to bring on Tom the following month, once his contract with Motorworks ended. The original Wilsons team was slowly reuniting, bringing with them the values and skills that had made the shop special for decades. As Frank walked through the service area that afternoon, checking on the progress of repairs, he paused to watch a high school student carefully changing oil under Joe's supervision. The kid was part of the shop's new mentorship program, which welcomed students from the local vocational school for real-world experience. "Keep your eye on the gasket," Frank heard Joe telling the young man. "A tiny tear can cause a big leak." The scene brought a smile to Frank's face. This was how he had lent himself, all those years ago, careful guidance from someone who cared enough to teach properly. Later that afternoon, a familiar truck pulled into the lot. Mr. Reyes from the plumbing company climbed out, looking worried. "Frank," he called, hurrying inside. "My main van's making a terrible noise. I've got 3 big jobs lined up this week. Can't afford to be without it." "We'll take care of it," Frank assured him, already reaching for a clipboard. "And don't worry about rushing to the bank today. We can work out the payment like we used to." Mr. Reyes' shoulders visibly relaxed. "This is why I drive across town to come here now," he said. "You folks understand what these vehicles mean to people like me." As the day wound down, Linda stopped by with a fresh-baked pie for the staff, a Friday tradition she'd started the second week they were open. As she set it on the break room table, Frank caught her looking around the shop with pride in her eyes. "What?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Just thinking about how things work out," she said, squeezing his hand. "6 months ago, you were so worried about what would happen next. And now look at all this." Frank nodded, taking in the sight of Joe laughing with Ben as they cleaned up their bay, the wall of thank you cards from satisfied customers, the schedule board filled with appointments for the coming weeks. That evening, as Frank was locking up, a local newspaper reporter who'd been waiting in the parking lot approached him. "Mr. Miller? I'm doing a story on small businesses making a comeback in our town. Would you have a few minutes to talk about Wilson and Miller's success? People are saying you've taken half of Motorworks customers in just 6 months." Frank thought about how to answer. He could have mentioned how Motorworks was struggling to stay afloat, how Richard had been replaced by a new manager trying desperately to win back customers with discount coupons. He could have pointed out that 3 more Motorworks mechanics had submitted applications to join Wilson and Miller just this week. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "In the end, people don't bring their cars to brands or systems, they bring them to people they trust." The next morning, that quote appeared on the front page of the local business section. By noon, Robert had framed the article and hung it on the wall of their waiting room, right next to the original sign from Wilson's Auto Repair that they'd rescued from storage. Looking at that sign, the past and present connected, Frank knew that being fired after 30 years hadn't been the end of his story. It had just been the difficult middle chapter in a story that was still being written, one repair at a time.